Fear. That's what undocumented immigrants live with. A fear that ICE agents will identify, detain, and deport them. This fear has eroded trust in the police. However, it is not unique to undocumented immigrants, but rather extends to racialized and marginalized communities who are similarly under constant surveillance and are over-policed. Imagine the streets of your community being flooded with the police. Imagine being stopped and questioned because of your race, where you live, or how you sound. This is the reality of over-policing, and this reality only works to diminish confidence in law enforcement.
Hello everyone, I'm Alex.
I'm Lucas.
I'm Sato.
And I'm Alina.
And we're all second-year criminology students studying at UTM. And today's talk will cover the shocking events currently taking place in the United States regarding the U.S. Immigration Customs Enforcement, or more commonly known as ICE. There are actions which are clear examples of over-policing, and now I will hand things over to my colleague, Sada, who will expand on the subject.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So today we're going to talk about domestic immigration enforcement, specifically the role of ICE and how it connects to broader issues of over-policing and legitimacy in our communities. So let's start with the foundation. What is ICE? ICE is the federal agency responsible for enforcing immigration laws inside the United States. It's not actually at the border, people might expect that, but it's actually within communities. Historically, immigration enforcement focused on external borders, controlling who enters the country. But starting in the 1980s and accelerating after 9/11, there was a major shift. The government began creating what scholars call the Homeland Security State. And that's a system focused on domestic enforcement where immigration control happens everywhere, not just at the border. Here's where it gets critical. ICE doesn't just do this alone. It partners with local law enforcement through specific programs. So for example, there's the 287G program, which allows local police to be trained to enforce federal immigration laws, and it secures communities, which requires local police to share arrest fingerprints with ICE databases to identify potentially deportable individuals. So what this means in practice is that it's a routine traffic stop. It's like a visit to a courthouse or even being near a school. It could lead to immigration enforcement action. The distinction between local police who are supposed to serve the community and federal immigration agents becomes blurred. This specific partnership has extended significantly. So since 2010, states have enacted over 1,200 immigration-related laws, and many were focused on enforcement. During the Trump administration, for instance, 18 new 287G agreements were signed within Texas counties alone in just 1 month. And the result of this, it's that undocumented immigrants are now living under what researchers call deportability, which is a constant awareness that they could be detained or deported at any moment in any place during any interactions with institutions or the authorities. My colleagues here with me today, they will be examining these dynamics between ICE and the police, and they will be connecting them to research on over-policing and state legitimacy. For the sake of this TED Talk, we will be defining over-policing as a disproportionate police focus on a racialized population or neighborhood. Firstly, Alina will be analyzing Wong and Shkailen study from 2024 regarding ICE and local police cooperation and how the underlying police strategy of over-policing affects people's lives.
Thank you, Sato, for that introduction to ICE enforcement. Now I want to examine the empirical evidence demonstrating why ICE operations represent a clear case of over-policing undocumented immigrant communities. So in 2024, researchers Wong and Shkailen conducted a survey experiment with nearly 600 undocumented Mexican nationals in San Diego County. Participants were randomly assigned to two conditions. One group was told local law enforcement would not cooperate with ICE, while the other was told local police were actively working with ICE on deportation raids. The researchers varied only this single factor to isolate its effects. The chilling effects extend far beyond interactions with law enforcement. 68% indicated they would avoid public events where police might be present, such as community festivals, neighborhood meetings, and public celebrations. Nearly 7 out of 10 individuals would withdraw from civic participation entirely because the enforcement presence has become so pervasive and threatening. 70% would avoid using public services requiring personal contact information. This means avoiding City Hall benefits their U.S. citizen children are entitled to, emergency services, libraries, and community centers. Any government interaction that creates documentation becomes too risky for them. The enforcement apparatus is not merely targeting criminal activity, it is making people afraid to access basic services. The economic implications are equally severe. 64% would avoid conducting business requiring personal information, no bank accounts, no loans, no credit history. Individuals cannot achieve financial stability where they cannot access basic financial services. The enforcement apparatus extends beyond crime control into systematic economic marginalization. 52%, more than half, would not seek new employment. Workers experiencing wage theft, safety violations, or exploitative conditions cannot leave their positions because the job search process requires documentation that could expose them to the enforcement. This demonstrates how over-policing systematically traps people in exploitation, maintaining a permanently vulnerable workforce unable to advocate for their rights. Among respondents with children, 43% would not place their children in after-school or daycare programs. Parents are forced to choose between their children's educational development and their family's safety from deportation. Children, mainly U.S. citizens, miss opportunities for education and socialization because enrollment creates documentation trails. This evidence demonstrates over-policing because enforcement targets people based on immigration status rather than criminal behavior. The scope extends far beyond law enforcement. When enforcement makes individuals afraid to open bank accounts, attend community events, or enroll children in programs, this is policing existence itself, not crime. It objectively reduces public safety rather than enhancing it. When 61% of witnesses and 43% of victims won't report crimes, criminal activity increases. It creates what researchers call system avoidance. Individuals are actively avoiding institutions designed to serve them because those institutions have become threats. This research was conducted in San Diego County, which has relatively welcoming policies towards immigrants. California maintains sanctuary state legislation, and San Diego has declared itself a welcoming city. Yet even in this favorable environment, merely informing people that local police might cooperate with ICE fundamentally altered their relationship with all social institutions. If these effects occur in one of the more welcoming jurisdictions, the reality in active hostile policy environments is likely substantially worse.
Building off Alina's point, it is clear that undocumented immigrants are reluctant to cooperate with law enforcement due to their fear and distrust of police. In fact, as Alina mentioned, immigrants who were told that ICE were working with local law enforcement said they would be less likely to report crimes, give out contact info, or even participate in public events. But extending the conversation beyond the actions of ICE and undocumented immigrants, this fear and distrust of police is prevalent in many other marginalized and racialized communities. In fact, criminologists Christy Metcalf and Qasim Balaji point out that Black and Hispanic individuals hold negative views of police as the low-income and disadvantaged neighborhoods they live in are characterized as crime hotspots and are over-policed, leading these individuals to become likely targets of police activity and pushing them to view the police as untrustworthy and oppressive. Moreover, to be effective, the police must be seen as legitimate. Legitimacy is the belief that authorities or institutions are proper and just. A key component for achieving legitimacy is procedural fairness, which is the idea that the decisions and procedures of police must be transparent, fair, and free of bias. However, over-policing acts contrary to procedural fairness because it unequally and disproportionately targets certain communities, treating them as inherently suspicious and in need of constant surveillance. In fact, Metcalf and Balaji suggest that in disadvantaged communities that are over-policed, there are higher levels of legal cynicism, which is the view that the law and the police are illegitimate and incapable of establishing order or justice. When these police disproportionately target marginalized communities, they're seen as illegitimate because they are perceived as unjustly singling out and discriminating against individuals in these communities. To add, this community distrust and view of illegitimacy caused by over-policing has broader societal implications. Research by Roderick M. Kramer, a social psychologist, suggests that negative experiences with police, such as those brought about through over-policing and cynical attitudes towards the law, actually shift people's perceptions of police and shape how they interact with law enforcement in the future. For example, people may be less willing to cooperate with police, as we saw in the case with undocumented immigrants who stated that they were less likely to report crimes to the police due to their treatment. And some may even try to take justice into their own hands if they view the police as incapable of tending to their needs. Others may even try to join delinquent gangs as a substitute for police protection in hotspot crime areas, which only really exacerbates delinquency and criminal behavior in these communities. Furthermore, over-policing connects to the concept of the radical perspective of policing. This is the idea that the police are used as tools of the state to maintain the status quo by oppressing certain groups of individuals. Over-policing supports the radical perspective because it is a strategy used to reinforce an unequal hierarchy and maintain the status quo by ensuring racialized communities remain oppressed through tactics such as constant surveillance and aggressive enforcement, while upper-class communities and individuals belonging to this dominant or white race are normally policed in fair and unbiased ways. And connecting back to the actions of ICE agents, it's clear that they are actually serving the interests of the powerful by forcefully removing these undocumented immigrants who are essentially labeled by the state and those in power as safety and security risks rather than being seen as simple community members or those searching for a better life. Next, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Alex, who will touch further on the consequences of over-policing and interpreting crime rates.
To expand on what Lucas said, when communities are over-policed, it causes problems with the interpretation of crime rates, which act to reinforce stereotypes about racialized groups. When a community gets over-policed, the crime rate is bound to rise due to the higher presence of law enforcement in that area. However, this only makes it seem like these areas that are already being over-policed seem like they are hotspots for crime. However, this only leads to problematic interpretations of crime rates in those areas compared to other less heavily policed areas. The higher crime rates in over-policed communities feed into negative stereotypes about racialized groups because it makes it seem like there's more crime happening there than there really is. It makes it seem like these marginalized groups have a larger tendency towards crime and violence, when that's not truly the case at all. Now knowing this and connecting this back to what ICE is doing in America and what they're doing to undocumented immigrants as well, these undocumented immigrants are being so overly policed and being forcibly removed from their homes and taken away from their livelihoods. It makes it seem as though these immigrants are more of a threat and a danger to the community when simply they could just be desperate people looking for a better life for them and their families in the United States.
Lucas has demonstrated how over-policing creates profound distrust. I want to address what occurs when that distrust reaches a critical threshold, when communities transition from avoiding the system to actively demanding systemic change. This pattern of over-policing leads to movements such as defund the police. And I want to be absolutely clear, we would not be confronting this situation if communities trusted law enforcement in the first place. This movement did not emerge spontaneously. It developed from decades of communities articulating that you're not protecting us, you are policing us, without being heard. When 68% would avoid public events where police might be present, this represents systematic exclusion from civic life. When 43% of parents would not use childcare, families face impossible choices between their children's development and their family's safety. When systems repeatedly impose such choices across generations, communities eventually respond with enough. The defund the police movement is frequently mischaracterized. Critics claim it advocates eliminating all police. However, listen to what communities actually articulate. We do not want armed officers responding to mental health crises. We do not want police in schools criminalizing our children. We do not want every government interaction to risk deportation. We want resources invested in our communities, in housing, in healthcare, education, services that genuinely enhance safety. This connects to the conflict model we have studied. When communities perceive police as instruments maintaining an unjust status quo, enforcing evictions while ignoring wage theft, targeting street vendors while white-collar criminals face minimal consequences, they lose confidence in the entire institutional structure. The irony is clear. When communities demand change, they often encounter intensified enforcement. In 2020, following George Floyd's murder, communities protested police violence, and in numerous cities, the response was militarized police action against protests about police violence. This illustrates what occurs when legitimacy completely disintegrates. Wong and Schlien's research reveals the early stages of this breakdown. When individuals stop reporting crimes, stop seeking assistance, stop participating in public life, this represents a rational response to a system that has repeatedly demonstrated does not serve them. The question defenders of current approaches must answer is this: if over-policing enhanced community safety, if aggressive enforcement built trust, why do we observe the opposite? Why do 61% of crimes crime witnesses remain silent? Why do communities demand alternatives to policing? Calls for defunding and abolition are not attacks on public safety. They represent demands for genuine safety, for systems that protect rather than punish, for community investment rather than community surveillance. What we observe with ICE is systematic over-policing of immigrant communities with extensive, measurable consequences. Public safety deteriorates, communities become isolated, economic exclusion occurs, workplace exploitation persists, and children suffer. When 7 out of 10 people fear using public services, when 6 out of 10 witnesses will not report crimes, when half of all workers cannot escape exploitation, this is not a justice system. This is a control system, and it does not make anyone safer.
Thank you, Alina. Now you might be thinking, this is an American problem. ICE is a US agency and we're in Canada, so surely we're better than this, right? But the answer is actually no. Unfortunately, that is not the case. What we see with ICE and undocumented immigrants in the United States has direct parallels right here in Canada with how the RCMP treats Indigenous peoples on their own territories. So I'm going to show you 2 videos from the Wet'suwet'en territory in British Columbia. And in these videos, you're going to see the RCMP officers forcibly removing these land defenders from their own unceded territory when that land was never legally even given up through territories or formal agreements.
Near Houston yesterday, RCMP arrested 5 land defenders for obstruction of a peace officer. Wet'suwet'en Hereditary Chief Na'moks traveled to the territory to speak with those who remained. He has an issue with the arrests.
5 were arrested because of police.
Breaking down the door. Get out here. Breaking down the door.
Hey, show me your hands. Show me your hands.
Get that gun off me! Get your gun off me! Lower your gun!
I want to see everybody.
Get your gun off!
So what you've witnessed here is law enforcement being used to clear Indigenous people from their own land to make way for Coastal GasLink pipeline. And we noticed a few things, okay? First of all, the officers are covering their faces. It's as though they don't want to be identified or held accountable for their actions. Second of all, there is no procedural justice here. So you don't see them reading rights, offering access to lawyers, or just following proper protocol. And third of all, notice the power dynamics, especially how officers were reportedly less forceful with white supporters than with Indigenous land defenders. And this is what we call selective enforcement, okay? And it is based on who you are and not what you're doing. And this is exactly over-policing in the same way my colleague Alina described ICE's actions as. Remember the numbers she used? 70% of people avoiding public services and 61% not reporting crimes they witness? The parallel here is so clear. Just as ICE is making undocumented immigrants afraid to access public services or interact with institutions, RCMP makes Indigenous peoples afraid to exercise their rights on their own territories. And in both cases, law enforcement isn't targeting criminal behavior. Instead, they're just policing their existence. And ICE policies, for example, people for simply just existing without documentation. The RCMP policies for Indigenous people for simply also just existing on their unceded land. And these both create what Alina described as system avoidance. Just as undocumented immigrants withdraw from institutions that could serve them, Indigenous communities withdraw from engaging with a state that treats them as threats rather than citizens. Now think back to what Lucas said about legitimacy and procedural fairness. The police must be seen as proper and just to be effective. So their procedures have to be transparent, fair, impartial, and just free of bias. But what we see in these videos is just the complete opposite. The RCMP they're using force to serve corporate interests and not to serve the community or uphold justice. They're not acting as neutral enforcers of law. They're acting as tools of the state to maintain economic and political power. This connects directly to the radical perspective of policing that Lucas also mentioned. He explained this idea as that the police, they're used as tools of the state to maintain status quo by oppressing certain groups. With ICE, the status quo being maintained is one where undocumented immigrants remain marginalized. But with the RCMP on the Wet'suwet'en territory, the status quo being maintained is one where Indigenous sovereignty is completely ignored. So for example, natural resources, they're extracted and their corporate interests override Indigenous rights. And this way, over-policing reinforces an unequal hierarchy where Indigenous peoples are kept in their place. And through forced removal from their own territories, they're ultimately destroying land. And how can Indigenous peoples view police as legitimate? The same way as undocumented immigrants see ICE-partnered police as threats rather than protectors, Indigenous communities see the RCMP as enforcers of colonial disposition, and they're not seen as servants of justice. So when we talk about ICE, over-policing, and legitimacy, we're not just talking about an American issue. We're talking about a pattern that's been historically existing right here in Canada. Whether it's ICE partnering with local police to create this deportability for undocumented immigrants, or the RCMP forcibly removing Indigenous land defenders to clear space for pipelines, the mechanism is the same, which is law enforcement is being used to maintain power structures, not to serve communities or uphold justice. And these numbers, they aren't just found as statistics, okay? They represent a fundamental breakdown in the relationship between people and the state. And that breakdown is happening on both sides of the border in different communities, but they use the exact same tactics, of over-policing.
To reiterate, the actions of ICE in forcefully removing undocumented immigrants is a clear reflection of over-policing. However, the issues of over-policing extend beyond just the actions of ICE into broader marginalized and racialized groups. When these communities are over-policed, individuals lose confidence in law enforcement as they see the police as illegitimate. To add, over-policing supports the radical perspective as this strategy works to maintain the status quo by suppressing marginalized groups. Moreover, as my colleague Alex pointed out, over-policing creates problems of interpretations of crime rates as it makes it seem as if certain groups are more prone to crime. Next, as Alina pointed out, this distrust in police and police bias can lead to revolt and uprising, as seen in movements such as Defund the Police. Closer to home, Sarah has demonstrated how over-policing has come into play in Indigenous communities in Canada, who are being selectively policed and aggressively enforced to remove Indigenous peoples from their land. All in all, it is clear that over-policing threatens the foundations of justice by creating divide, distrust, and furthering oppression.
Act like what we call a shiest. I shouldn't.
Even like the fries and stuff, I'm sure they cook it with like chicken.
What's up?
Who will expand on this.
Yo, why?
Why you're not serving community?
You wanna go?
Yeah! Go!
This is the end. This is our dance. Take over.
Bam!
Thanks for watching.